You open the fridge tonight without thinking. A piece of fruit, some cheese, maybe last night's leftovers, reheated in 30 seconds. You don't wonder where any of it came from. You assume your ancestors ate something simpler than this. Mostly meat, mostly hunted, mostly torn raw off a carcass beside a fire. That's the story everyone tells you. But the real answer is far stranger than a campfire and a dead mammoth. For most of the last century, the picture of the ancient human diet was built around a single image. A hunter, a spear, a kill. Meat became the symbol of what made us human, the fuel that supposedly grew our brains and built our muscles. It's a clean story. It's also incomplete. Because the deeper scientists dig into the actual evidence left behind by ancient mouths, hands, and tools, the more it becomes clear that meat was never the whole picture. Sometimes it wasn't even the main one. So what were your ancestors actually eating tens of thousands of years before the first farm ever existed? The answer starts in a place you wouldn't expect. Not in a cave painting of a mammoth hunt, but in fossilized plaque scraped off ancient teeth. Christina Warrener, a biomolecular archaeologist who has spent years studying calcified dental plaque from skeletons across Europe and Africa, found something that didn't fit the meat-only story at all. Trapped inside that hardened plaque were microscopic starch granules, plant fibers, traces of food that had nothing to do with hunting. Her research showed that humans, and even some of their close evolutionary relatives, were eating starchy plants tens of thousands of years before anyone planted a single seed. The mouths of the past had been quietly keeping a record the whole time. Nobody had thought to read it. That record gets even stranger when you look at the tools your ancestors actually used. In 2010, archaeobotanist Dolores Piperno examined grinding stones recovered from sites in Italy, Russia, and the Czech Republic, some of them roughly 30,000 years old. Under a microscope, she found starch grains and microscopic plant residues embedded in the stone surfaces. Cattail roots, fern roots, plants that on their own are barely edible, but ground into a coarse flour and likely cooked over a fire, they became something far more useful. A stable, storable source of calories. Long before bread existed in any form you'd recognize, something remarkably close to it was already being made by hand, on a rock, beside a fire that had been burning for hours. Why would anyone go through that effort? Grinding roots into flour takes time. Hunting a deer seems faster, more dramatic, more rewarding. But ancient life didn't reward drama. It rewarded reliability. A herd of animals could vanish for weeks. A patch of tubers hidden underground did not run away. It didn't need to be tracked across miles of terrain in the rain. It just needed to be found, dug up, and processed. For most early human groups, plants weren't the backup plan. They were the baseline. Meat was the unpredictable bonus on top. This is where fire changes everything. Richard Wrangham, a primatologist at Harvard, built an entire theory around a deceptively simple idea. Cooking made you human. Raw food, especially raw plant matter, is hard to digest. Your gut has to work overtime to extract even a fraction of its calories. Cooked food breaks down cell walls and unlocks energy that would otherwise pass straight through you. Wrangham's argument is that once early humans started reliably cooking their food, they suddenly had access to far more usable energy from far less food. That surplus of energy didn't just fill stomachs. It fueled the growth of a brain that, calorie for calorie, is one of the most expensive organs in the entire animal kingdom. The fire wasn't just keeping you warm, it was rewriting what your body could afford to grow. So picture it differently now. Not a single hunter standing triumphant over a kill. A wider scene. Someone crouched at the edge of a wetland, pulling cattail roots from the mud. Someone else cracking open nuts beside a low fire. A handful of fish, trapped in a shallow pool as the tide pulls back. Insects, gathered without ceremony, eaten without hesitation, because they were abundant and full of fat and protein. Seasonal fruit, gorged on for the few weeks a year it actually existed. This wasn't a diet built around one food. It was a diet built around whatever the land was willing to offer that week, that month, that year, and the land offered something different depending on where you stood. That's the part the simplified story always leaves out. There was no single ancient human diet. There were thousands of them, shaped entirely by geography. Groups living near coastlines ate diets heavy in shellfish, fish, and seaweed, getting fats and nutrients that inland populations never touched. Groups in dense forests leaned on tubers, nuts, and fruit, with meat as an occasional windfall rather than a daily expectation. Groups on open grasslands had more consistent access to large herd animals, and their diets shifted accordingly. Even within a single group, the diet could swing dramatically between seasons. A summer of abundant fruit and fish could be followed by a winter survived almost entirely on stored roots and dried meat. Flexibility wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was the only thing that kept people alive. There's another kind of evidence that backs this up, and it comes from somewhere even less expected than teeth or grinding stones. It comes from the bones themselves. When researchers analyze the ratios of carbon and nitrogen isotopes preserved in ancient skeletons, they can roughly reconstruct what kind of food built that person's body over their lifetime. High nitrogen levels usually point toward a diet heavy in animal protein. Lower levels point toward a diet leaning on plants. When these isotope studies are run across different ancient populations, the results scatter all over the map. Some skeletons read almost like a wolf's. Others read closer to a deer's. Most fall somewhere confusingly in between, shifting from one season to the next, depending on what last year's harvest of nuts, fish runs, or migrating herds had been like. There was no fixed ratio your ancestors were supposed to hit. There was only what the land gave that year, and a body that adapted to absorb it. Think about how differently this played out depending on where someone happened to be born. Near the Arctic, where plant life is scarce for most of the year, ancient populations leaned almost entirely on fat and protein from seals, fish, and marine mammals, their bodies adapting over generations to thrive on a diet that would overwhelm someone from a tropical climate. Near the equator, where fruit, tubers, and insects are abundant nearly year-round, diets could lean heavily plant-based with meat as an occasional addition rather than a foundation. Somewhere in between, in temperate forests and grasslands, diets swung back and forth with the seasons, dense with nuts and stored roots through the cold months, opening up to fresh greens, eggs, and small game once the weather turned. None of these populations were eating the ancient human diet. They were eating the only diet their specific patch of earth could support, refined and adjusted over thousands of years until their bodies and their food supply fit each other almost perfectly. Here's where the twist gets uncomfortable for anyone who's ever bought a bag of paleo snacks at the grocery store. The modern diet built in the image of your ancestors is, in some ways, the opposite of what actually kept them fed. The popular version sells certainty. Eat this, not that. Meat good, grain bad. A simple rulebook applied to everybody in every climate. But the real ancestral pattern wasn't a rulebook at all. It was constant improvisation, built on knowledge passed down through generations about which roots were safe, which berries were poison, which insects were worth the effort, and which seasons demanded you eat almost anything you could find just to survive until the next one. Your ancestors weren't loyal to a macronutrient. They were loyal to whatever didn't run out. And the consequences of that diversity are still written into your body today. Some populations whose ancestors relied heavily on starchy roots and grains carry extra copies of a gene that helps break down starch in saliva. A head start their digestive system still gives them before food even reaches the stomach. Populations whose ancestors depended on dairy from herded animals are far more likely to digest milk comfortably as adults, a trait that simply doesn't exist in populations whose ancestors never had that option. Your gut, your saliva, even the bacteria living inside you right now was shaped by a specific diet your specific lineage survived on for thousands of years. There is no universal ancestral menu waiting to unlock your true biology. There's only the menu your ancestors happen to have access to, written quietly into your DNA. So why does the meat and fire image still dominate the story? Maybe because it's simpler to film than a wetland full of root diggers. Maybe because a hunter with a spear feels more like a hero than someone patiently grinding fern root into flour. But simplicity isn't accuracy. The plaque on ancient teeth, the starch grains on 30,000-year-old grinding stones, the isotopes locked into old bones, all of it tells a quieter, messier, more resourceful story. One where survival depended less on strength and more on knowing the land intimately enough to never go hungry, no matter what the season took away. There's an irony hiding underneath all of this too. The modern fascination with eating like your ancestors usually comes from a desire for simplicity. One clear rule, one approved list, a way to stop thinking so hard about food. But the actual ancestral skill was the opposite of a fixed rule. It was the ability to think constantly about food, to track which plants were fruiting, which animals were migrating, which roots were safe to eat after the first frost, and to adjust without hesitation the moment any of it changed. That mental flexibility wasn't a burden to your ancestors, it was the entire survival strategy. Somewhere along the way, that adaptability got flattened into a marketing label on a box of crackers. Which brings the question back to you, standing in front of your fridge tonight. You probably won't grind a fern root or dig a cattail from the mud anytime soon, but the instinct underneath the convenience is still there, quietly inherited. The reflex to check what's available, the mental note of what's running low, the small comfort of variety, of having more than one option in case the first one runs out. Even the mild anxiety you feel scanning an empty shelf at the grocery store traces back to a much older, much higher stakes version of that same feeling, one your ancestors carried through entire winters. You think you're choosing dinner? Really, you're running a calculation your ancestors ran every single day of their lives, just with far higher stakes and far fewer choices. The fridge changed. The instinct behind it never did.